still trying to get rich." The words land like a fork clattering against fine china. For a second, the world narrows to the half circle of the dining gable. My hand paused midway to my mouth, the roast steam blurring the chandelier lights. Kyle's mouth moving as if he hadn't just dropped a pebble into a quiet pond, but a boulder. Emma's plastic ponytail bobbed, Jake's mashed potatoes tilting dangerously toward his plate. The television in the corner, tuned to the evening news out of habit, throws a pale blue on the wallpaper. My face is on that blue. There is a beat where nobody breathes. My daughter, Brenna, mid-lift of a cranberry spoon, freezes with her eyebrow arched the way she does when she's deciding whether to reheat the leftovers or toss them. Kyle is smiling that sideways smile people use when they want to look clever without doing the work of being kind. Behind him, the mantle stockings sway from a draft I didn't notice until then. It feels absurd, like a tableau put together to amuse someone else. My name, Margaret Thompson, appears in the Chiron. Founder, stitch your dreams. A clip runs, me in a studio, hands fanning a stack of colorful yarns, a line about 50,000 students, a mention of partnerships overseas, a passing reference to the platform being valued at roughly $750,000. The anchor says, "From a retired teacher to an online phenomenon," and the camera lingers on a shot of my hands, showing a cable stitch that at home would be nothing more than a way to make a sweater stay put. The room tastes like gravy and astonishment. Someone coughs. The wine glass in front of me trembles as if it too is deciding whether to judge or forgive. I smile because there isn't anything more useful to do. I have spent the last 6 years learning how to translate people's motions into lessons, how to say calmly what seems obvious in retrospect. Don't knit the sleeves too long, or count twice, cut once. Teaching had trained me to pause, to give people space to figure things out. In that stillness, I decide what to say. "You hear that, Kyle?" I say lightly, letting the kitchen light warm the edges of my voice. That's what happens when you underestimate someone's hobbies. He blinks. The cleverness fades. Brenna's shoulders hunch in a way that tells me she wants to climb into my lap and hide. Emma whispers something about Grammy's famous, and Jake snorts a small island of amusement that makes me love him all the more for his honesty. If I am honest with myself, and I've learned the benefits of that exacting practice, my irritation isn't only about the jab. It's about the decade of little jokes that acted like builder's twine around a bigger truth. People, even those you love, can treat reinvention like a misdemeanor. They can reduce the work of starting over to a punchline at the family table. I had, in truth, been startled by the segment on television. The reporter had been kind. The producer had taken the time to capture footage of my kitchen table with yarn strewn like small islands, of students logging in from a dozen time zones, of a woman in Mumbai smiling at a pattern I wrote. That story doesn't erase the years before it, nor the months when the business was a sputtering light, not even a glow, but it rewires how others see me, and seeing me differently is its own kind of upheaval. If you're watching this and you've ever been dismissed, patronized for an idea, for a passion, for a skill that didn't fit the picture someone else sketched for you, tell me one word in the comments right now. Underestimated? Keep it short. I want to read those words. I am Margaret Thompson. For 30 years, I taught 3rd grade, which is to say I taught the first rules of life in many small, patient sessions. How to hold a pencil, how to say please and thank you, how to understand that work requires the slow accumulation of small habits. When the school closed during the pandemic, as so many did, I stood at the sink with a bar mop in my hands and felt a strange, sudden lightness where a life had been. I knit more to calm the noise. At first, it was a thing to keep my hands busy, wool as a metronome for the days. I started videoing short clips because a friend joked that my knitters group would be lonely without my voice. I had no plan. I had a camera borrowed from my son-in-law's cousin, a patchwork of enthusiasm, and the ancient habit of teaching. Pick a clear problem and offer a clear solution. Make it small, repeat it often. Slow, then steady is how it grew. A pattern here, a helpful short video there. Someone shared a link in a Facebook group. A woman in Arizona posted a sweater she'd made after following one of my classes. People started writing to ask if I offered something deeper than a short clip, something like a course, a community. I stayed awake nights structuring lessons the way I'd structured school units: warm up, practice, review. I learned keywords, website layouts, the modest terror of learning how to invoice. I learned that patience is marketing and that giving real value is the antidote to the noise. I did not set out to be wealthy. I set out to have meaningful work again and a small income that might buy better groceries and maybe a summer class for Emma. Prideful? A little. Necessary? Absolutely. There is dignity in earning, even modestly, from labor you control. Saying that out loud used to feel crass, but it's true. Choosing to make work of your own means choosing not to be defined by someone else's timetable. But none of that mattered at the table when Kyle decided to make the joke. He wasn't the first to assume. Over the years, family jokes had been regular enough to have a rhythm. They were microaggressions dressed as affection. You're still knitting? When's the retirement village hosting your craft fair? Are you selling those online, or do you just give them to good causes? I learned to carry them the way you carry a heavy coat, on because you want to, and only sometimes taking it off when you were with friends who understood you. This is a thing about being older. People assume you are less dangerous. They assume your ambitions are small and harmless. They think old hobbies and new businesses are different categories. In their heads, you're either retired and content or you're an overreacher. Rarely do they put the words serious and senior in the same sentence. When I tell that to people now, they laugh because it's absurd, but the laughter has a thud to it. The day after the dinner, the house fills with the quiet after earthquakes. Calls, messages, invitations to coffee. There is an energy that feels like an effort to domesticate the surprise of my success. Some reaches are tender, my neighbor bringing over pies, an old friend offering congratulations. Some are thinly veiled requests, an aunt asking for connections to the platform, an old colleague wanting a discount for volunteers. Most awkwardly, there are the calls from my daughter and son-in-law that belong to a different register altogether. "Mom," Brenna says on the phone, voice flat with strain, "can we come over this week? Talk." "Of course." I can hear the muscles in her jaw. "Everything okay?" She says something about the kids and the car needing repair, about Kyle's work hours being odd. It's the sort of problem I recognize, patchable, familiar, solvable with a little help and a little elbow grease. It is not the sort of thing I will use as a sign that I am someone's bank. I have had offers before to help, the kind where help becomes a script. You hand over money and they develop expectations, often in silence. Expectations that you will be available, expectations that you will be consulted, expectations that you will solve future problems. Help given without boundaries becomes a lever used for control. It is a generosity steeped in the giver's extinction. So I do what I have learned to do in the classroom, create a structure that teaches. I speak to Brenna long enough to let her list all the problems. She does. She is raw about some of it, about the piles of bills, about nights she lies awake embarrassed because she can't figure out where the money went. She does not and never does ask me outright for a handout. There are pride muscles in that woman that remain unbroken. But she also understands the practical fact of a mortgage and of children who need predictable dinners. When I suggest help, I frame it as exactly that, help that teaches. I can give you $15,000, I say plainly, but it's a gift with conditions. We'll meet with Dr. Patricia Hoffman for 3 sessions within the next month, and you'll agree to a plan. We will also check in. This is not an ongoing rescue, it's a bridge. She starts to protest, automatic, breathy, the way people do when pride and fear collide. "Mom, we can—" I hold up that soft voice that used to calm 30-second meltdowns in third grade. "Brenna, this isn't about shame. It's about creating a space where you can stop being in a cycle that eats morale. If we parachute in every time the money gets tight, nothing changes. If we invest in skills and a plan, there is a chance of a different pattern." There's silence. I can hear her inhale, then the long exhale that signals the surrender of someone who would rather be defeated than explain vulnerability. "Okay," she says finally. "Okay, 3 sessions. We'll do it." That okay is the first small victory. It is not dramatic. It will not be the kind of scene people write home about in a memoir, but it marks a shift from doing to learning. We set a day for the first meeting. I mail the check with a note that simply says, "For the bridge. Love, Maggie." No fanfare. A small ceremony of accountability is the only celebration I want. People will read the number and have opinions. $15,000 is not nothing. It is also not an unbounded river. I selected the amount precisely because it is big enough to relieve an emergency and small enough to require discipline. It buys breathing room, not a lifestyle. It is a teaching moment dressed as a gift. When I tell Kyle, face to face over coffee, he scoffs, at least at first. "$15,000? Might as well buy a truck," he says, grinning the grin of a man who thinks in concrete and volume. I saw that grin every time we talked about money before the news clip. It is a practical grin, a builder's grin. He sees a number and wants to multiply it into materials and trucks and projects. He did not see stitches and patience the way I did. "You making a business of yarn now?" He says it as if it's a theatrical aside. He means to be funny. It lands as a dart. I do not rise to the bait. I explain the structure to him as if he were a parent-teacher conference I politely disagree with. It's a course. It's a community. It teaches people how to do something that might otherwise intimidate them. There's value in that, Kyle. People pay for value. He snorts. Then his face flutters into something softer. Maybe he's recalibrating. Maybe he's recognizing that the person at the table this time is not simply a hobbyist. Maybe he's thinking about his own pride. He stammers something about contributing to the check if they need help. I decline politely. This is not about his tax advantage. It is about teaching my daughter how to stand. Children's eyes are blunt instruments of truth. Emma watches us, then looks up at Brenna and says, "Mom, remember when you said Grandma only knits for fun?" The sentence lands like a small flag. Brenna flushes. Kyle gives a half laugh that is more nervous than amused. I feel a cool happiness that the kid's innocence is the cleanest lens we have. We meet with Dr. Patricia the following Tuesday in my dining room. She is the kind of woman who tucks her hair neatly, who listens with her hands cupped like a bowl. She asks practical questions about income, about debt, about what the family wants the kids to learn. Her language is simple and precise. Cash flow, emergency fund, one-time expenses. And she draws a plan on a legal pad. Nothing messianic, nothing miraculous, just a map. They promise to do the work, set aside small amounts, pay down high-interest debt, keep a tally. The work, as ever, is where the change hides. People like to imagine boundaries as rigid walls. They forget a boundary can be a fence with a gate, that it can be made for safety and for beauty. My rule about the money is intended as a fence with a gate, solid terms, loving enforcement, and an invitation to pass through with effort. I have learned you can love with limits. Limits teach the people you love how to value themselves again. The days after the meeting are awkward in the way beginnings often are. Kyle tries to be casual, texting a picture of his truck as he always did, but there's a new calculation behind his texts. Branna calls more. Sometimes it is a small victory, like we balanced the books this morning, and sometimes it is the raw ache of someone who woke up late because she forgot an appointment. I short message encouragement. I set up a simple online system to receive updates because I am a creature of systems and because keeping it impersonal avoids the temptation to take on guilt. There are practicalities. Branna agrees to use part of the $15,000 to stabilize the household, car repairs, a catch-up on utilities, an emergency dental procedure for herself that she had been putting off for months. We're not solving every problem, but we're diffusing panic. Kyle, initially prickly, takes an interest in a small skill I have, counting expenses the way a contractor counts studs. He learns a little. He jokes less and asks more. I like that. I don't pretend I enjoy being in this position. There is a fatigue to always being the adult who speaks not only for herself, but for everyone at once. There is a private ache at family dinners when the bill comes and someone looks at me with calculation, that tired arithmetic of, is she going to pick up this tab? I hate that feeling in my gut. It is the old nausea of being sized up as an ATM, so I make sure every interaction is clear. This is a bridge, not a bank. The TV story lingered longer and the holidays. Calls from reporters I didn't know. One magazine asked to profile Stitch Your Dreams. People I taught 20 years ago found me on Facebook and wrote notes that felt like warm hands on an old shoulder. The platform had, in truth, become something different, a small engine that kept me awake sometimes at night for the right reasons. No one had to tell me I had been lucky. I had, but luck made fertile the soil I had been tending for years. On a Saturday, mid-January, I found myself finishing a set of lessons that a partner company had asked me to create. The kitchen smelled of orange peel and cinnamon. The kids were overdoing the macaroni in the sink. I was typing a lesson plan when the phone rang. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. Then I saw Brenna the name appear, and I answered. Her voice on the other end was thin with something I couldn't name at that first sound. "Mom," she said, and the one-syllable name stretched into a private geography. "I'm at the hospital." My heart rearranged abruptly. The corner of the kitchen felt colder. The sunlight seemed to fall at a different angle. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my hands steady on the counter. She took a breath that sounded like a wordless apology. "Work. There's been an incident. They said chemicals, fumes. They took me in. I can't think straight. They say I might have exposure." There are moments when your training, teaching, organizational work, whatever discipline shaped you, kicks in like muscle memory. You know at a cellular level how to prioritize. The first thing is to listen, then to collect facts, then to hold space. There is no room for hysteria. There is room, however, for action. "Where are you?" I asked. "Which hospital?" She named it. I remember the lights of that building from when I brought Jake in with a sprained wrist 2 summers ago. The memory of him moaning about missing Minecraft, an absurd and tender recollection, made the floor of my calm steadier. "Okay," I said. "Stay where they tell you. I'm coming." In the car, I felt every texture of the world more intensely. The way the heater hummed, the radio announcer's voice humming unimportant news. I thought about coats and melodramatic narratives about mothers showing up in rubber-soled shoes, but the truth of the drive was quieter. Worry that is precise, practical. I called Janet Morrison, the lawyer I had met through a friend when a neighbor had fallen at the grocery store. Janet's voice is the kind that makes you feel less alone, steady, not theatrical. I told her where I was headed. She said she would be there as soon as she could. The hospital waiting area is a set design of quiet terror. Plastic chairs, vending machines that glow like lonely relics. I sat and breathed and looked at the polished floor and at the scoreboard that listed patient names like a dry roll call. I texted Emma to ask about the kids, and she sent back a photo of herself holding a sign she made, "Get better, Mom," with glitter that refused to stay in a neat pile. Small things in crises act like proof that the world continues to be ordinary in the parts that matter. When Brenna emerged from the ER, someone had wrapped a hospital blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes were unfocused, and she had the puzzled, frightened look of a person whose interior map had been smudged. She smiled when she saw me, a small, fragile thing. "Mom," she whispered. This was not the drama of a soap opera. It was a human being in a moment of disorientation. The doctors talked about decontamination, about exposure levels, about tests that would take time. There were forms, questions about her workplace, about what she had been doing in the hours before. I listened and asked calm, necessary questions. I wrote down names, numbers, what the nurse said. In that moment, the boundary I had set with money felt like a different apparatus. It was not a refusal to step in. It was a framework that had taught me where to be strategic rather than performative. I could see the difference between the two like a map with clear borders. Enabling would have been to swoop in and promise unexamined aid for every problem. This was not that. This was a time to use the resources I had. Financial, yes, but more than that, logistical, relational, practical, to make the case that what had happened was not a personal failing. It could be a corporate failing. When I visited her the next day, the smell of antiseptic was everywhere. Brenna couldn't remember the wind that had been in her hair when she left for work or the color of the jacket she'd worn. She could, however, recite the names of Emma's favorite cartoons and the recipe for her grandmother's lemon bars. The holes in her memory, those strange, frightened blanks, were the scariest thing to see. That was no longer a fixable matter with a check that covered rent for 2 months. This looked like a longer, harder path. I thought of the systems we put in place, Dr. Patricia, the counseling, the budgets, and how those were tools not just for money, but for thoughtfulness. I called Janet and described what had happened, giving the factual little packets of information I had gathered, names of supervisors, the time of the incident, the medications the ER had suggested. Janet's voice, patient and precise, said, "I'll start by calling Dr. Sarah Chen. She mentioned concerns at that plant beyond what the company admits." Dr. Sarah Chen was a former employee at the plant where Brenna worked. She had once been in an internal meeting where concerns about ventilation and storage had been raised and, according to Janet, numbed. Janet's tone lowered with something like professional caution. "If Sarah will talk, we'll have a chorus of corroboration," she said. "These things often hinge on paper trails. We'll document every test, every note, every time the company delayed maintenance. We'll build a case." My first instinct when someone I love is injured is to sit at their bedside and knit, because that is what I do to soothe. But when the injury might be systemic, when it might be preventable or repeated, knitting will not change the policy. Advocacy will, and patterns matter. So I find myself becoming, in the softest possible way, both a caretaker and a strategist. I make calls. I organize. I ask for copies of medical reports. I make lists. That night in the hospital room, Brenna sleeps with the oxygen hiss, like a small, unsure lullaby. I sit in the chair and think about how the dinner table looked 3 weeks before, how a mocking line could be so quick and yet so telling. The warmth of the TV light had been replaced by the clinical white of an IV stand. My mind moves between the two images like a cartographer marking coasts. I do not know what the future holds. I only know with the kind of clarity that comes when life suddenly narrows to the present, that there are strategies that work better than sentiment. I have learned that love and limits are not contradictory. They are, in the long run, the best combination. I tell myself often that the hardest work in a family is not the grand gestures, but the small, steady insistence on truth. When Brenna came home from the hospital with that shuttered map of memory, truth looked like paperwork and patience. It looked like node after node of small facts: the time she clocked out, the name of the supervisor who signed the safety log, the model number of the solvent she'd been working with. It looked like, as Janet said, in a voice that made the words feel doable, we need documentation more than drama. Janet moved with a confidence I liked, a lawyer whose hands were practiced in turning confusion into an object you could grasp. She walked me through things I had seen in television courtroom dramas and made them ordinary: preserving evidence, getting statements, subpoenaing maintenance logs. She made clear what I already suspected from Brenna's foggy descriptions. This wouldn't be the sort of story that settled easily if you relied only on feelings. This would be the kind of story that settled when details aligned and a whistleblower sang the same notes. Dr. Sarah Chin came into our lives like a light in a basement. Janet tracked her down through a colleague in occupational health. Sarah had left the plant a year earlier, exhausted and morally distressed, and she had kept copies of reports she'd been asked to file, copies that contradicted what the company later put in their safety audits. When she and Janet met in a coffee shop, I sat in the far corner, knitting a rhythm that steadied my hands. Sarah's hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and she spoke quickly, as if rushing away from the possibility that someone in power might notice her. "I wrote to my supervisor," she said, unfolding a stack of printouts. "I recorded concerns about the ventilation in Storage Bay B. I told them the seals were faulty. I asked them to replace filters quarterly instead of semi-annually. They said it was budget. They said we needed to prioritize production." She tapped the papers like a metronome. "I kept copies." That phrase, "I kept copies," is the kind of practical detail that changes everything. You cannot argue against a file stamped with time. You can yell, you can rage, but paper, if it is honest, remains. Together, Sarah and Janet started untangling a pattern: delayed maintenance requests marked as completed, invoices for replacement parts that never matched vendor records, internal emails that softened concerns into cost considerations. When Janet showed me the emails, my stomach turned into someone else's geography. The company had chosen throughput over people in ways that were not abstract. They had prioritized margins while their workers inhaled vapors. We did the hard, unglamorous work. We took copies of Brenna's medical reports to specialists. We organized her notes about days she couldn't remember. We cataloged coworkers who had similar episodes. Janet put out a call in careful legal language: no promises, only procedures. And one by one, other workers started to speak. They were hesitant at first, then braver as they realized they were not alone. Their stories were not identical, but they fit together like puzzle pieces that revealed a picture you didn't want to see. There were moments that felt cinematic in their discomfort, depositions where a plant manager's smile thinned and his voice turned to static, an internal memo that used the phrase "temporarily acceptable" to describe a failed safety valve, a supplier's invoice that didn't match the company's ledger. There were also moments that felt quietly brave. Steve, a line foreman, writing a statement about how he had lost his sense of smell for weeks. Maria, who worked the night shift, describing headaches that woke her at 2 a.m. These were not dramatic revelations in the way the tabloids imagine drama. They were small truths that, once arranged, made a case. There was also fear, which is its own kind of honesty. Sarah worried about the repercussions of coming forward. Some of the workers feared lawsuits and lost hours. Others feared not being believed. We tried to address those fears without pretending they weren't real. Janet offered protections where the law allowed, and the support system, the small bay of people who had once orbitally known me through yarn and class, became, to my surprise, an actual support structure. Former students offered statements of character. One of my partners, who ran a wellness collective, posted a calm public piece about corporate responsibility. The chorus grew. You should know, because this matters, that nothing in this process felt like poetic revenge. I had no taste for revenge. Vindication, when it came, was a plain thing, a recognition that someone else had been forced to account for choices and that the accounting mattered. I stayed with Brenna in the hospital when she slept badly. I sat in depositions when my experience with organizing and documentation helped. I made sure Brenna saw that she was not alone, that she had a network that included legal counsel and scientists who could interpret toxicology reports. At home, the family dynamics shifted in ways both subtle and seismic. Kyle, who had always been quick with a joke that cut and then retreated, began to show a different shape of caution. When I first told him that we were organizing the case, he rubbed his jaw and said, half blunt, half uncertain, "Do you really think this will change anything?" He was trying not to be invested, because being invested meant confronting his own mistakes, the mocking at the table, the assumption that my work was a hobby. He wanted to keep his hands free to rebuild whatever pride had been bruised. But rebuilding, when it is honest, looks different than before. Kyle went to a trades class on business management that the local community college offered. He found himself drawn to the problem-solving side of construction, estimating, planning, safety, and he started doing small jobs on the weekends for neighbors who wanted someone careful rather than someone fast. It wasn't instant metamorphosis. He was human, he was stubborn, but as the case progressed, he began to understand what it meant to be accountable, not only financially, but morally. When he offered to fix a wobbly stair in the stairwell at the plant, unasked and unpaid, it felt like an apology not given as a speech, but lived in action. Brenna's recovery was not linear. The exposure left her with headaches and memory gaps that sorted themselves into manageable pieces with therapy, patience, and time. She did her sessions with a neuropsychologist who used routine and puzzles and the slow return to normalcy that comes with practice. Some days ended with victory. She could remember a recipe again, or she would call to tell me she navigated the grocery store without confusion. Other days were small surrenders, a forgotten appointment, a phone number misplaced. Those days were hard. They required me to exercise compassion that was not sentimental, but active, helping her set reminders, accompanying her to doctor's appointments, sitting through paperwork. The lawyers, Janet in particular, moved in ways that protected Brenna's dignity. Janet made sure medical records were shared with specialists who could speak plainly about the connection between exposure and symptoms. She built a coordinated class action style case, not because we wanted the label, but because the company's behavior affected more than one person. When you are dealing with a corporation whose practices have ripple effects, the legal strategy must reflect the scale of the harm. We were careful to note that this was a strong case because of the documentary evidence and the whistleblower testimony. Janet always reminded us, sensibly, that not every workplace injury leads to big awards, and she was careful to avoid language that might sound like a guarantee. Negotiations dragged in the way negotiations do, offers and counteroffers, each framed with legalese and the dull arithmetic of risk. The company at first tried to minimize. They hired lawyers who spoke in numbers and probability. They suggested isolated incidents. That is what defensive structures do. They fracture narratives into accidents. Janet and her team, methodical and patient, assembled a file that was hard to collapse: maintenance requests, internal emails, supplier invoices, testimonies from multiple employees, and the clinical reports linking exposure to cognitive symptoms. The story those documents told was not one of chance. There were days that the paperwork felt like a second job. I found myself reading depositions as if they were the chapters of a book I wanted to understand, not for drama, but to make sure we didn't miss anything that could hurt the case. We learned the language of discovery and the choreography of litigation. There were hearings where the room smelled faintly of coffee and too bright lights. There were mediations in rooms with bland art on the walls that felt like set pieces for people whose job was to make things end. Janet never dramatized. She did not lean into righteous anger. She leaned into method. And then, one gray afternoon in late summer, we heard the number. The company offered a settlement, $2.4 million to be divided among the injured workers and to provide for medical care and future support. When Janet told us, I felt something complex, relief so heavy it almost ached, gratitude and an odd wash of mourning for the simplicity of the life we'd had before this all began. We accepted the settlement with caveats that ensured medical oversight and funds for long-term care. The amount was the result of a confluence: strong evidence, whistleblower courage, legal skill, and a corporate interest in avoiding a public trial that would expose internal documents. It was not a moral mea culpa in the way we might wish. It was a pragmatic accounting that put resources where they would matter. Janet was clear to remind us, as she had from the start, that every case is different. We were fortunate, she said, because our facts were strong and our witnesses consistent. Hearing the number reverberated through the family in ways that were not simply financial. For Kyle, it landed as a complicated thing. Guilt softened with the possibility of practical help. Brenna took the news with a quiet that was not joyless, but thoughtful. She asked that some funds be allocated for continued therapy and for a trust that could help Emma and Jake with college costs one day. The workers who had testified felt some validation. They could pay for care and make safety demands that the company could not as easily resist now. I felt, surprisingly, something like relief that the world had not had to force us into ruin before someone listened. But relief does not erase the nights when Brenna woke up scared, or the emails that came from other workers whose lives had been derailed in smaller, quieter ways. My satisfaction was steady, not theatrical. I did not parade the settlement. We kept many details private because dignity matters in victory as in defeat. What happened inside the family after the settlement was the real work. Not paying bills, though that was a practical relief, but negotiating pride and respect. I wanted, with a fierceness I did not expect, for the shifts in behavior to be sustained. I wanted Kyle and Brina to build sensibilities that would last. So we had conversations, some awkward, some tender, about the $15,000 I had given earlier. I had been clear about its purpose, a bridge, not a lifeline. Brina had used it responsibly. Car repair, emergency dental work, catching up a bit on utilities. It had bought breathing room. Later, when the settlement allowed for greater stability, Brina returned the unused portion into a small savings account earmarked for the children's future, and we used a portion to seed a modest home safety consultancy Brina started with a former coworker who had technical training in industrial ventilation. She became, in time, a cautious but convincing voice in workplace safety circles, translating her experience into advocacy. She did it not only for herself, but for other workers who could not afford to speak. Kyle, as I said, did something quieter. He started his own small company repairing and renovating with safety at the center. He was meticulous in permits and in ensuring dust mitigation practices. He hired a young man who had been out of work. He learned to listen to people on his crew about conditions they did not feel comfortable bringing up to foremen. He matured without fanfare. His mocking laugh at the table grew rarer, and in its place surfaced a readiness to ask for help when he didn't know something. At a family dinner about a year later, our dining room now with a framed print of one of my favorite stitch patterns on the wall, we sat in a circle that felt different. The fork was no longer an instrument of judgment. The television was off. The kids were older, their chatter less breathless and more curious. Kyle cleared his throat in a way that meant he had rehearsed apology in his head. "Maggie," he said, using the name with an affection that was not casual. "I'm sorry. I didn't see you. I thought I saw you." There is an odd courage in saying something like that. An apology is a small thread that, when pulled, can reshape a seam. He did not dramatize, he did not demand absolution. He offered a recognition and then put his hands on his knees like someone ready to work. Brina, who had the habit now of choosing her words carefully because of the exercises that sharpened memory, leaned in and said simply, "We both owe you respect, and we both want to do better." I accepted their apologies the way I had always known how to accept, without making them into trophies or into sentences. I let them be what they were, an honest recalibration. If the first part of the story had been insult and a TV light, the second part was less about spectacle and more about the slow labor of being better. There are mornings now when I sit at my kitchen table with my cup of tea and check the platform's analytics. Stitch Your Dreams operates differently than it did in the early, jittery months. We have partnerships in 3 countries, a staff of 5 part-time teachers, and a community moderating group that keeps the chat encouraging and competent. The platform is still valued in the neighborhood of what the reporter said, figures that some people hold up as proof of success. I do not keep the number as a talisman. I keep it as a reminder of what steady work can produce when mixed with humility and a willingness to learn. I have reinvested in things that matter to me: a small scholarship for adult learners who want to retrain in vocational skills, a fund for former students who are caregivers and need flexible access to classes, and a modest donation to a local clinic that screens chemical exposures, because I want the infrastructure that helped Brenna to be more accessible. I do not parade my giving. Generosity, to me, feels like a table set for someone who might be cold. People sometimes ask whether the public humiliation at Christmas ever stopped stinging. The answer is complicated. There are nights when memory flares, the fork midair, Kyle's sideways grin, and the sting returns, not as a sharp edge, but as a lesson. I have learned to see that moment as a hinge point, not the sum of everything. In the end, what I wanted most in that moment was not to be proven right so much as to be respected. Respect is quieter than applause. It is adult-to-adult engagement. Do I regret the firmness of my boundaries? Rarely. There were days, especially during Brenna's recovery, when the costs of firmness felt personal. Being the one to say no at the right time, to hold a line while your child suffers, can make you feel like a person split in two, part guardian, part disciplinarian. But in the long view, the boundaries taught accountability. They created a structure that allowed adult family members to learn how to stand on their own while still giving them the safety of a bridge when the bridge was necessary. If you are listening and wondering whether to set a similar boundary in your own life, I will not tell you exactly what to do. I will tell you what I learned. Boundaries work best when they are clear, compassionate, and enforceable. They work best when they connect to a plan that helps people gain skills rather than merely offloads shame. And they work best when you are prepared for the loneliness that occasionally accompanies standing firm. People who knew me for 30 years sometimes blinked at my resolve. Some were quietly proud, and some were puzzled. That, too, is part of the cost. There are practicalities that I do not want to minimize. The legal process was draining in ways you cannot imagine until you sign a medical release or sit through depositions. It took time away from my work. It took time away from evenings when I might have been home with a cup of tea or a new pattern. There were nights when I went to bed thinking about discovery requests and woke up thinking about Brina's seizures of forgetfulness. There were days when I felt resentful. At the company, yes, but sometimes at the slowness of institutions to care. Those feelings are honest, but not end pieces. You have to move through them the way you move through any grief, with practice and with small mercies. One small mercy, in the end, was how the kids reacted. Emma and Jake, who had been the blunt instruments of truth at the Christmas table, grew into cleaner-hearted observers. They learned early that people are more complicated than jokes. They saw their parents make mistakes and then work to correct them. They saw that money is not a solution to everything and that dignity cannot be bought. When Emma drew a picture for me one afternoon, a row of stick figures holding hands with the word rescue crossed out and help written beside it, I laughed and cried and kept the drawing on my fridge. There was a point where I had a conversation with Brina that I remember as if it were a small cathedral. We sat on the back stoop with tea and the hum of an evening that could have been ordinary. She turned to me in that direct way she has when she is trying to find the precise word and said, "I wanted you to fix everything." And then I realized what I needed was to learn how to fix some of it myself. Her hand brushed mine in a gesture that did not require melodrama. "Thank you for not making it easy." That sentence is one I keep in my pocket. It reminds me that the hardest love is often the love that stops rescuing and starts teaching. It is a paradox that feels like a secret unlocked. As for Kyle, there were moments of private reckoning. He would call sometimes, unforced, not needing to be asked, and tell me about a building code he had learned that day or about a crew member he had helped. Once he came by with a small throw pillow he had made using one of my patterns, literally a little thing that looked like a peace offering. He was never asked to make reparations theatrically. He chose to do the work quietly. That change mattered more to me than any public apology staged for cameras. The settlement money, wisely used, allowed Brina and other workers to get care and to advocate for safer practices. The company, under the terms of the agreement, funded a third-party safety audit and instituted some new training programs. I watched with cautious hope. Companies sometimes change policies quickly but revert slowly. You cannot legislate moral growth. You can, however, force procedures to have teeth. That is where our energies went, towards systems that made safety less optional. There are moments, even now, when I have to reckon with the fact that I sometimes felt lonely in the fight. People who love you can also be tired of the conflict, friends who want to return to tea and knitting and not be pulled into litigation. That is understandable, but I built a team, lawyers, doctors, friends, and former students who wanted to stand for something they believed in. The unexpected blessing of leading Stitch Your Dreams was that it had created a community that could be mobilized quietly and thoughtfully. Business-wise, Stitch Your Dreams continued to grow. I hired a program manager who took on the day-to-day so I could be present with family when needed. We added short safety courses about materials handling for crafters who worked with dyes and solvents. Practical things, a small ripple from what had happened with Brenna. We started a modest grant program for older adults who wanted to start micro-businesses. I like thinking about that work as an extension of the values that taught me to hold the line: dignity, skill, and the capacity to teach. When the holidays came around the next year, the mood at the table was different, not because the past had been erased, but because people had learned new muscles. We ate with fewer scripts and more conversation. Kyle made a point of asking about the work I was doing, genuinely curious, and Brenna told a story about a safety seminar she had given at a community center. The kids, now older, asked real questions. How do you know when you're helping and when you're rescuing? Emma's voice had acquired the impatient wisdom of a child who has learned to watch adults carefully. I answered as honestly as I could. You listen, you set terms, you ask whether what you do helps someone learn to stand on their own. Simple answers are rarely sufficient, but they are honest. There are people who will read our story and think it a cautionary tale about money or about how to police family. That is not what it is. It is a story about the ways love can be firm and how one woman's late reinvention intersected with long-standing family patterns to create a test. It is about how institutions have responsibilities and how sometimes ordinary people must insist they be met. If I could go back to that moment at the Christmas table, I would change one thing, that I would have said less and listened more. Not a dramatic revision, just less reactivity and more the calm of someone who knows the value of small steps. But life is not a return loop. You take the lesson and knit it into your next piece. People often ask me what I would tell my younger self. I would say, be brave in small things and patient in big ones. Boundary setting is not an act of coldness. It is an act of respect for the other person, a way of saying you believe they can be better if given the right tools. It is also an act of respect for yourself, saying you do not exist to be everyone's bank or every relative's safety net without conditions. One last practical thing. After all the legal and medical storms, we built a small routine in our family. On the first Monday of each month, we have a house meeting, a short time to check bills, discuss schedules, and talk about anything that's going wrong or right. It is a discipline that sounds dull and is in fact one of the most nourishing things we created. It keeps conversations adult and prevents unspoken resentments from hardening into bricks. And me? I keep knitting. I still get letters from people who took a course and discovered a hidden confidence. I still hear from students who tell me they learned patience through the rhythm of the stitch. My platform continues to be a small engine for teaching practical skill and for building community. Those are the pleasures that sustain me, seeing someone master a cable stitch, having a mother write that she taught her son to knit for the first time, receiving an email from a student in another country who translated one of our patterns into her language. Those are the intangible earnings that matter more than the fleeting sheen of a news segment. When I reflect on the arc, on Kyle's mocking line at the dinner table that became a title in people's heads, on the way a TV light can so quickly reframe a life, I do not feel triumph. I feel a steady, wry satisfaction that comes from having acted in ways that aligned with my values. There is a toughness to that satisfaction. It is not flashy. It is the result of doing the day-to-day work of building a life that can withstand surprises. If you have ever been underestimated, or if you've ever had to stand firm and say no for the sake of someone you love, I would love to hear about it. Tell me one sentence in the comments about a time a boundary helped you or pushed you. If nothing else, it reminds us we are not alone in the messy work of being human. Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more about reinvention, about my work with Stitch Your Dreams, or about how we navigated those legal and family waters, subscribe and share a story in the comments. The next time someone asks, still trying to get rich? Maybe the answer will be quieter. No, I'm trying to be enough.